This might be the most heartbreaking hero in westerns. Four vicious outlaws suddenly kicked the door open. The father instinctively reached for the rifle on the wall to protect his wife and daughter, but the next second... But this was far from over. The inhuman bandits then turned their evil hands toward the defenseless mother and daughter, indulging in their brutal desires. However, the little boy hiding in the corner showed no emotion. He stared wide-eyed, memorizing every face of the bandits and every feature deep into his bones, etching them into his mind. After the bandits finished their atrocities, they brutally killed the mother and daughter. Before leaving, they set the boy's house on fire. The trembling boy was surrounded by flames. In his moment of despair, a pair of big hands suddenly picked him up and hid him under the wagon. The boy watched the raging fire, swallowing his heart-wrenching pain without making a single sound. Just then, he spotted a spur the bandits had dropped, so he quickly picked it up quietly. Perhaps this was his only clue to find his enemies. When the bandits were completely gone, the little boy finally broke down. His cries of pain were heart-wrenching, filled with despair and hatred. Time flew by. 15 years passed. The little boy had transformed into a tall, strapping tough guy. Over those 15 years, from revolvers to all kinds of rifles, he mastered every single firearm. He kept at it day after day, for one purpose only: to avenge his family. But unfortunately, he had no leads on his enemies for 15 years, until one day, a stranger showed up in town. The two men met and sized each other up. Frank could see the fierceness hidden in this young man, and Scott could see in his eyes a shrewd, calculating cunning. Not long after, two more cowboys in black arrived in town. Frank immediately hid in the hotel, looking grave, as if he had sensed the danger. Sure enough, late at night, the two cowboys found his room. They snuck in through the window.
Da questa parte.
The quest of party, but the experienced Frank was prepared and took them both out by surprise. The gunshots quickly drew the town sheriff. Although Frank had acted in self-defense, the sheriff still told him to leave town soon. He didn't want the town to become a battleground. Frank had no choice but to leave. The next day, the sheriff found Scott, trying to convince him to join the police force, but accidentally, he spotted a spur hanging on the wall. It looked very familiar, so he took it down and told Scott the two cowboys who died last night had spurs exactly like this one. This made Scott extremely excited. Learning that those two cowboys had been killed by Frank, Scott didn't hesitate for a second. Without a word, he chased after Frank immediately. He was certain Frank knew more about his enemies, but he underestimated Frank's cunning. He hadn't been following long when Frank caught him red-handed. With no other choice, Scott had to tell him his real purpose. After hearing this, Frank said maybe they were after the same people, but he had to go see them first, and told Scott not to follow. But Scott wanted to go with him for revenge, but Frank flatly refused. No one knew what Frank was really planning. However, he didn't harm Scott. He just took Scott's horse 10 miles away to slow him down. Soon Frank arrived in East Clear Spring town, then walked straight into the fanciest hotel in town. He ordered a whiskey and asked the bartender about a man named Kavanaugh.
Senti, amico. Io vendo whisky.
It looked like Frank was in the right place. Everyone there stared at him menacingly, but Frank had seen it all.
Tu che vuoi?
All bark and no bite. Frank immediately went to the hotel's presidential suite and finally met his first enemy, Kavanaugh. This was the man who had betrayed him and sent him to prison for 15 years, and the two cowboys who had been chasing him had been sent by Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh tried to attack him by surprise, but Frank knew him too well. Frank's demand was simple: 15 years in prison, $1,000 a year in compensation, $15,000 total, not a penny less. But Kavanaugh was extremely arrogant. He only pulled out $100 to dismiss him and insisted he didn't have that much money. Just then, Frank noticed a photo of another enemy on the wall. This enemy had become an official in Lindon City. Who would have thought the bandits from back then were now all successful and powerful? Frank gave Kavanaugh one day to get the money, or he wouldn't be so merciful. Just then, Scott arrived at the hotel. He saw a gambler being thrown out. All his money had been stolen. Scott didn't hesitate and decided to help him get his money back. His appearance immediately alerted everyone in the hotel, especially the bouncers, who all glared at him fiercely. Scott casually stopped a waiter and gave all the money on the tray back to the gambler. The gambler was completely stunned. He couldn't believe someone would be so bold. The music stopped abruptly.
Posate i dollari e filate.
Non esco mai senza aver finito prima il mio bicchiere.
Scott's shooting was flawless and immediately silenced everyone. Then someone tried to fight him hand to hand. The 6-foot-tall Scott wasn't afraid at all. He took them on one by one, and two by two.
Così è tutto sistemato.
The sheriff saw what was happening, quickly put on his badge, and prepared to arrest Scott for causing a disturbance. And the judge across the room even threatened to sentence Scott to 10 years in prison. It all sounded so absurd. Just as the bouncers were about to grab Scott, Kavanaugh stepped forward and cleared Scott of all charges. Of course, he wasn't being nice. He wanted to use Scott's skills to help him kill an enemy. That night, Scott went to the target's room and looked around carefully and saw a pair of boots behind the curtain. When he was about to attack, he realized he'd been tricked.
Mani sopra la testa, bambino.
Kavanaugh's enemy was actually Frank. Unfortunately, despite his great shooting skills, he wasn't quick enough. Frank told him to stop interfering. Kavanaugh owed him $15,000. He didn't want Scott to ruin his plan. However, Scott tried to ask about Kavanaugh, but Frank avoided the question, refusing to say anything. With no other choice, Scott went back to the gambler he'd helped and asked him about Kavanaugh. But the gambler didn't know much. But he introduced Scott to an old drunk who knew the area well. From what the old drunk told him, Scott finally learned it, that Kavanaugh was one of the men who had killed his family. To confirm his identity, he went to the hotel's gambling table and asked to play with Kavanaugh. But when it came to playing cards, he was no match for Kavanaugh.
4 assi. Anch'io.
The tattoo of 4 aces on his chest proved he was the man Scott was looking for. One of them, Scott could no longer contain his anger as he remembered the horrific massacre from 15 years ago. A showdown was inevitable. Scott fired 4 shots in a row, unleashing years of pent-up hatred. Kavanaugh's men saw what happened and immediately fired back, but they were no match for Scott. Just then, his 6 bullets ran out. At that critical moment, Frank stepped in to help him. Then he gave Scott 2 important lessons. First, always watch your back. Second, always count your bullets. After leaving the hotel, Frank took Scott's horse again, but this time, he left information about another enemy. What happens next? Will Scott find all his enemies one by one and complete his 15-year-long revenge? And what secret is Frank hiding? Find out next time.